What's up, everyone? Welcome to Stat Chasing Week 3. I am your host, Sam Hoppen, and if you haven't watched the show before, this is where I'll be going through some of the key stats that I think are important to help lay a foundation for understanding what happened this past week and going forward heading into the next week. We got a big show today, going to cover a lot. We got the Raiders surprising a lot of people. We have the Carolina Panthers wide receivers and a bunch of other situations to go through. But before I get into the details, want to walk through the stats that I'll be talking through today. And it includes data from a bunch of sources. First and foremost, PFF. So that's the routes data that I have that includes targets per route run and expected fantasy points, which you'll see on most of the charts that I've been sharing. Expected fantasy points is essentially a model built that weights opportunity by the line of scrimmage, the type of opportunity that's given to each player, and is a great way to measure usage, in my opinion. We've also got a lot of data from NFL Faster, which is the play-by-play data for the NFL. This is where I get all my air yards data, which includes Whopper weighted opportunity rating, which is Josh Hermsmeyer's stat that weights target share and air yards share. We also have Racer, which is receiver air conversion ratio, which is just the receiving yards divided by the air yards for a player, and is essentially a receiver's ability to convert air yards into actual receiving yards as an efficiency metric. And then on the flip side, we have Pacer, which is pass air conversion ratio, which shows how well quarterbacks or the receivers are converting air yards into actual yards, and is just passing yards divided by passing air yards. And then finally have quarterback adjusted yards per attempt, which is yards per attempt, but it weights it a little bit with some negatives given with interceptions and positive for touchdowns. And then a couple of stats popularized by friend of the show, Ben Gretsch, which includes weighted targets per route run, which weights air yards and routes run with a scalar included in there. And then high value touches, which is a running back specific metric, includes carries inside the 10-yard line and receptions. So these are intended to show, again, another volume and opportunity metric to show which running backs are getting the most high value touches. So in the show, I'm going to be going through stats position by position so that I can be comparing against others within the position to help you guys make your start sit, your waiver decisions, or any trade decisions you might have in your leagues. And then I'll go a bit more in depth through some team situations at the end that stood out to me and some of the other people in the Discord as well. A quick reminder to subscribe to the Ship Chasing YouTube channel and become a member for just $5 to get early access to the show, access to the Discord, and several other benefits. And want to give a shout out to @ChangeCollege on Twitter, who is doing the timestamps for us on YouTube for each of the positions and the team conversations, which is an extremely big help if you want to just jump to some specific situations that I'll be talking about. So with that, let's get into the quarterbacks. I'm going to pull up the quarterback chart here. For the chart that we're looking at, we have adjusted yards per attempt on the x-axis and the touchdown rate, which is just the number of touchdowns a quarterback threw divided by his number of pass attempts, because we're looking for efficiency from our quarterbacks, especially in DFS, not necessarily looking for volume. And then the size of the bubble for each player is the number of rushing yards. So here we're looking at just the week 2 stats for this chart. And I think starting next week, I plan on making charts for not only the previous week, but a rolling 3-week average just to see how different quarterbacks have been trending and try to get a grasp of how they've been playing recently. But let's talk through a couple of quarterbacks specifically. Starting on Thursday night, Taylor Heinicke got the start with Ryan Fitzpatrick getting injured in week 1. Heinicke scored 20 fantasy points this week and didn't actually look as terrible as I think some people thought he would. A lot of people, myself included, thought that the game Thursday night was not going to be that great, but Heinicke threw for 344 air yards in week 2, which is good for 7th on the week. He threw for 336 actual passing yards, which is really good. One of the couple of quarterbacks that had over 300 passing yards on the week. He doesn't have quite the same rushing upside as some of the other quarterbacks. As you can see, his bubble is pretty small. He only rushed for 6 yards this week, but he could be a Tannehill-like quarterback that could end up rushing for 15 to 20 yards per game and maybe get into the end zone every once in a while. His 7.4 adjusted yards per attempt was middle of the road this week, which is about where I'd expect he'll be throughout the season. Not super efficient, but good enough to be supporting Washington's pass catchers. On the show last week, I actually highlighted the Washington football team as one of my individual teams and said that it was a buy low opportunity on Washington's pass catchers. And I think you still might have that opportunity to do so outside of Terry McLaurin, who had a good night on Thursday. And I would still be doing that. I know Diami Brown was dropped in a number of leagues heading into week 2, I think simply because the general industry doesn't think that Heinicke could support that many receivers. So I'd be scooping him up where I could. Washington's upcoming schedule before their week 9 bye includes the Bills, the Falcons, the Chiefs, and the Packers, all of whom have either shown that they'll put up enough points to pressure the opponent into passing or have allowed some solid passing games. So I don't think Ryan Fitzpatrick being out of the mix for a while is all that bad for the Washington pass catchers. Moving on is Jalen Hurts, who threw for 190 yards, didn't throw a touchdown despite a 91-yard pass to Quez Watkins. They actually didn't end up scoring on that drive, which is absurd, but he still scored over 20 fantasy points, which shows you how much of his legs can bring. He was right behind Heinicke in air yards with 335 air yards on the week, but again, only finished with 190 passing yards, 91 of which came on that single catch. So not a great day passing, but he hasn't been the worst passer, and his completion percentage over expectations, CPOE, which is another stat coming from NFL Faster, essentially measures how high above expectation quarterback's completion percentage is. Hurts was at 3.9% on the season, which is 13th in the league. He did end up going downfield a lot more in this game. His week 1 average depth of target was a measly 3.8 yards, and his week 2 average depth of target led the league at 14.5 yards this past week. His ADOT last year was 9.1 yards, so hopefully the trend towards more deep passes continues and that is receivers can actually convert those air yards into actual air yards, because sort of in congruence with his ADOT going up, the pacer for Hurts dropped from 2.1, so 2 receiving yards for every air yard in week 1 to just 0.6 in week 2. And again, the reason so many people drafted him and why he'll continue to be a starting fantasy quarterback is because of his rushing. Week 2 was the second game with over 60 yards rushing this year for him. And in the 5 games that he started and finished, including the 3 games that he started and finished last year, he's averaged 76.4 rushing yards and doesn't have a game with fewer than 60 rushing yards. So he certainly has the Konami code baked into him and baked into his upside. It gives him the floor that a lot of other quarterbacks don't have. And his day was saved because he got a goal line carry after a 14-yard completion to, Dallas Goedert, in which Goedert got tackled at the 1-yard line. He just plowed it in. And that's the thing about rushing quarterbacks, though. One rushing touchdown can completely flip the way that their fantasy day goes. And it did in this case for Jalen Hurts. Speaking of dual threat quarterbacks, Justin Fields saw a lot of game action this week after Andy Dalton suffered an injury in the first half of the game. Dalton's status is still up in the air for the upcoming week, and the donkey Matt Nagy said that Dalton is still going to be the starter when he's healthy. But I still want to talk about Fields anyway with the limited playing time he got, because I think if he does start that, and I'll talk about this here in a second, if he does start, the rushing floor that he provides, again, gives him a solid opportunity to be a good fantasy quarterback. And in the game this past week, Justin Fields threw the ball 13 times. He rushed the ball 7 times himself. Technically, he had 10 carries, but 3 of those were kneel downs at the end of the game. He finished 6 of 13 for 60 yards passing, but it's tough to just go in the middle of a game as opposed to having the head coach actually formally commit to you as the starter. So, like I said, he's similar to Jalen Hurts, not quite as much rushing upside, but he could be certainly a solid bye week replacement when those come around. If he's the starter by that point, I really just hope that Fields gets the opportunity that he deserves. As a couple of quick hitters to round out the quarterback position, I said last week that Jared Goff could have a solid year just based off of the volume that he's going to get. And he's back at it again with over 20 fantasy points. I believe he's quarterback 8 through 2 weeks. And he can even run the ball, as Phil B. Burnzone on Twitter pointed out last night. He had more rushing yards this past week than Najee Harris, Chris Carson, and Melvin Gordon. So not something you should be banking on every single week, but certainly something that gives him an extra ability to score points. And then Aaron Rodgers had a big bounce back, as many predicted, throwing 4 touchdowns, 3 of which went to Aaron Jones. I believe his ADOT was like one yard heading into the half, because a couple of his passes were just sort of those drop passes you'll see when Aaron Jones was cutting across. And we have Crosby joining me in the room here today again. Really, really excited about this Aaron Rodgers bounce back. So if you hear him in the background, that's why. But not a lot else changing in the quarterback landscape. Really sucks that Tyrod Taylor just announced that he's going to be on injured reserve, but we'll talk about some of the Houston wide receivers a little bit later. So next, I'm going to talk about the running backs. On the chart here, we have receiving expected fantasy points on the x-axis, rushing expected fantasy points on the y-axis, and then fantasy points over expectation as the side of the bubble, which I'll refer to as FPO. And the biggest storyline of the week, aside from probably Aaron Jones, was Derrick Henry. His 6 receptions on 6 targets were both career high marks for him. I'm sure you've heard that a number of times over the last couple of days. His routes per dropback number was right around 44% last year, which is actually pretty solid. He just wasn't getting the targets as much as you would expect. on a rate that high, but he had a 46.7% routes per dropback rate this past week, which was up from 34% in week 1. And Jeremy McNichols seemed like an actual threat to the passing down work. And I think is what a lot of people thought Darrynton Evans would be. He's obviously on IR right now, but Henry already has nearly a third of the targets in 2 games this year as he had all of last year, which Mike Leone, I think, made a really good point on Twitter yesterday that the bar for Henry's targets being a factor in his fantasy outcome was so low. I mean, he's averaging about 25 or 30 targets per season, that it was so low that it should have been a little bit more of a consideration in his upside case for this season. But again, it was most likely that they would stay flat, that they would sort of stay where they were because there weren't any major changes to the Titans offense outside of adding Julio Jones. And there was really only one direction that the targets could go if the assumption of his target usage was wrong. So I think, again, it's obvious, but if he continues to see 4 to 5 targets per game, then his upside is going to be a lot higher than when he was only getting 1 or 2, because that will hopefully make him less game script dependent. A couple other notes: Henry had 5 and 11 high value touches in 2 games so far for an average of about 8 per game, and he only averaged 3.4 high value touches per game last year. His first 2 games with 11 and 48 fantasy points respectively are I think a small microcosm of what his career has been so far. He can have a low floor when he gets taken out of the game because of the game script, but when the Titans truly lean on him, he'll be the highest scoring player on the week. I will say that Jeremy McNichols, I think, is probably worth an add if you have the space, because he will be involved if Henry goes down, and it'll likely be a split between him and Darrynton Evans. And if for some reason that passing opportunity doesn't stick for Henry, then he's most certainly going to be a beneficiary for that. The next team level situation for running backs that I want to talk through is the Patriots running backs. Every offseason, it's a big deal is made about how much of a headache that backfield is. And right now, it looks like it's just Damian Harris and James White in this backfield. Harris and White have played 48 and 43% of snaps so far, respectively. No other pass running back has had a snap share above 10% in a single game. Ramondre Stevenson, unfortunately, it is no longer Ramondre Stevens season. He didn't play a single snap this past week, so I think he's probably a clear drop at this point until he gets more involved. But White has been consistent with 11 total opportunities in each of his first 2 games, while Harris has had 17 plus in each of the first 2 games. Where White has the edge, and this should come as no surprises with the high value touches. White has 13 on the season compared to just 7 for Harris. And granted, all but one of those have been receptions for White, but his 12 receptions rank second behind just CMC. Harris got 3 green zone touches, which are rushes within the 10-yard line, which was tied for 4th on the week among all running backs. Another positive for James White was that he remained involved and caught passes despite the Patriots having a positive game script for nearly the entire game against the Jets. White has had a route per dropback percentage of 40 and 55% in the first 2 great games. So it's great to see that bump up in week 2. I think a lot of people asked what the point of James White was on some teams, and this exactly was the point. Mac Jones starting and peppering White with targets more so than Cam Newton would have if he had been the starter. For the next situation, we have the Broncos running backs. A lot of eyes in the ship-chasing multiverse are on Javonte Williams. So going to talk about the Broncos running backs next. Fortunately, it's only Melvin Gordon and Javonte Williams in this backfield. There are no other Broncos running back has recorded a snap for the Broncos this season. Unfortunately, Melvin Gordon has been the 1A in this backfield so far in terms of opportunities. After having a dead even split in snaps last week, he outsnapped Williams 59% to 41% in week 2. But Gordon and Williams each have 29 total opportunities over the past 2 games, with Williams having the edge in carries by 3 carries. Surprisingly, I think Gordon has actually been the bigger receiving threat with 5 total targets across the 2 games and has a routes run rate of over 45% in each of the 2 games, while Williams hasn't had a rate above 40% in either game. So for now, I think this will remain a near even split between the 2 running backs, which isn't necessarily a death sentence for Williams, but it will likely take an injury to Melvin Gordon in order to for Williams to get a sort of 75% plus share of the opportunities. That's certainly not out of the question because Gordon has dealt with his fair share of injuries in the past, but not something you want to bank on for the rest of the season. For the next situation, I don't plan on covering the same situation in back-to-back weeks. At least I hope not to, but it will happen sometimes because the things change in the NFL very quickly. So this week I'm going to do that with the Bills running backs because Zach Moss played this week after being inactive in week 1. So when Devin Singletary was the main guy, but let's see how things got split out in week 2. Singletary was the starter and actually was the lead back again. He had 16 total opportunities for the second straight week. This time he scored 16 PPR points with a solid 82 yards on 13 carries, scored a 46-yard rushing touchdown, and had 2 catches for 9 yards. Singletary also outsnapped Moss 66% to just 28%. And what's most impressive is that Singletary ran a route on 64% of dropbacks, which is the second week in a row he's had a rate at least that high. And what saved Zach Moss's day from being a complete dud was getting 3 green zone rushes and converting 2 of those for touchdowns. But Singletary was way more efficient than Moss was. I think it seems like right now Singletary is the near every down back with PPR upside, and Moss is the sort of short area bruising back with some touchdown upside if he can fall into the end zone like he did this past week. And we'll need to see what happens in week 3, but everything points to Singletary being the RB1 in Buffalo, which is counter to how Singletary and Moss were being drafted this offseason, with Moss, I believe, going a round or 2 ahead of Devin Singletary. Another committee to talk about is the Cowboys backfield, which a lot of people didn't think would be a committee heading into the season, or maybe they did, but it is a committee. It's led by Zeke. I don't think either running back is going to be a top 5 fantasy back with the other one in the mix, but they'll still be able to provide some weekly upside, which is with how good the offense is. Zeke has had snap shares above 70% in each of the first 2 games, while Pollard hasn't had a snap share above 35%. Obviously, Pollard has looked like the better back and has been more efficient. Adam Levitan tweeted the other day that Zeke outsnapped Tony Pollard 45-21 on Sunday, but Zeke had 55% of the running back carries and 40% of the running back targets. Pollard's been way more efficient, though, turning 23 touches into 183 yards and a touchdown so far. Zeke has gotten 8 more touches, but has almost 50 yards fewer and a score as well. So again, I think you're probably talking about Pollard as a low-end RB2 or a higher-end RB3 just based on the efficiency alone. Zeke is probably closer to a running back 2. Pollard has averaged 1 more high-value touch per game so far, and each of them got a green zone rush this past week against the Chargers. But Zeke continues to run more routes. He had a 70% route rate on dropbacks in each game, but Pollard's had a solid targets per route run of 35%. So when he's running routes, he's getting targeted. It's just a matter of him actually getting on the field. So these guys, I know a lot of eyes will be on this backfield for throughout the season, and I know a lot of people are hoping that Pollard breaks out as the RB1, but I doubt that happens while Zeke is in the fold. I'm going to wrap up the running backs section with the Buccaneers running backs, and thank God Ship Chasers, because Ronald Jones has life. It still wasn't a great day, but he got out of the doghouse after fumbling in week 1. It really was just between him and Fournette for snaps. Jones was at 41%. Fournette was at 49%. And Fournette had another solid day. He had 15 opportunities and a 43% routes per dropback rate, along with 5 high-value touches. What I think is most surprising is the pass catching work that Fournette has gotten so far. I think a lot of people expected Giovanni Bernard to do that, but at this point, Bernard is just a situational player for the Buccaneers. He played just 10% of snaps this week. I think unless you're really desperate for running back depth, Bernard can probably be dropped at this point. He had a routes per dropback rate of 12.5%, which is not what you want to see out of a presumed PPR pass catching back. As crazy as it is to say, Fournette is probably the only one that I'm trusting in a lineup right now, but I'd have to be pretty needy to go to him. Jones did have 1 high-value touch and 9 total opportunities this week, which is up from the 4 opportunities that he had in week 1. It's a good thing that the Buccaneers will be leading in a lot of their games. What isn't great is the Buccaneers currently lead the league in pass rate over expectation by a large margin right now. So there probably isn't a lot of room for this running back room unless you're catching passes, and Fournette is the one to be doing that right now. A couple other nuggets to point out for running backs. Saquon Barkley played 84% of snaps, which was up a drastic 36% from his 48% snap rate in week 1. He was also up to a 71% routes per dropback rate, which was nearly double his week 1 rate. But that offense is just not great right now. The offensive line is struggling to give him many opportunities to break big runs, and he's probably a low-end RB1 right now. You're going to do anything with it, but hopefully gets the squeaky wheel, gets the grease this Sunday against the Falcons. Interesting tweet from TJ Hernandez this afternoon, but some of the biggest increases in backfield touch share from week 1 to week 2, we had Peyton Barber up 52% to 52% of running back touches in week 2. James Robinson was up 45% to 88%. J.D. McKissick was up 34% to 38%. And Aaron Jones was up 33% to 74%. I think A.J. Dillon truthers out there are not happy about that, but we'll see if sort of these wonky game scripts change that going forward. It's time to calm down on Austin Ekeler not getting any targets in week 1 because he caught all 9 of his targets for 61 yards, which was good for a 23% target share on the team this past week. David Montgomery saw a bump in snaps, route rate, targets since he missed some snaps in week 1 because of an injury, and he took all those opportunities away from Damian Williams, who just remains a handcuff, albeit a valuable one at this point, as he doesn't seem to have any standalone value with Montgomery healthy. And then talked last week about the Jets backfield, and I think it's pretty clear that you can drop Tevin Coleman now. He played just 7 snaps on Sunday, and the Jets offense sort of looks like a bit of a mess too. Michael Carter saw an increased role with 14 total opportunities, and really at this point has very little friction to becoming a solid fantasy starter and running back to moving forward. It's just a matter of that offense getting going with Zach Wilson. Moving on, we've got the wide receivers. We'll talk about these again in terms of wide receiver groups, highlighting some individual players, but we have the weighted targets per route run that I mentioned on the x-axis and air yards market share on the y-axis, and the size of the bubble is a receiver's FPO. Starting off with the Jaguars wide receivers, we have a case of the good, the bad, and the ugly. Marvin Jones is exactly who I think we thought he was, the team's deep threat and possible wide receiver 1 right now. He's posted 100-plus air yards in back-to-back weeks. He's one of 7 receivers to do that so far, the others being Brandon Cooks, Marquez Valdes-Scantling, Tyler Lockett, Justin Jefferson, Keenan Allen, and Stephon Diggs. So that tells you a little bit about the role that he's had so far this season. His 1.029 weighted targets per route run was phenomenal and was 4th among wide receivers this week. He's currently averaging about 18 PPR points per week, which is good for wide receiver 16 on a points per game basis, thanks to touchdowns in back-to-back weeks. And then the bad is sort of DJ Chark, who went from 199 air yards in week 1 to just 62 air yards in week 2. I would try to buy low on him if I could, because his peripheral numbers are solid so far this year, and he just had a down fantasy week, which is how it will likely go. The ugly, unfortunately, is Laviska Shenault. He finished with 2 catches for -3 yards on 7 targets. You can see his dot on the chart on the very bottom left here is extremely small because his FPO was so low, which I guess is the silver lining for him. He actually had a higher routes per dropback rate than Chark did, but it wasn't that by that much. He also had a higher target share at 21% the second straight week, with a target share above 18%, but he is dealing with a shoulder injury. It sounds like he'll be able to play against the Cardinals this week, which is good, but probably not starting him in redraft leagues because of the bad start that he's had on top of the shoulder injury, but I'm not dropping him quite yet either. In a more positive light, a fun, surprising storyline coming out of Minnesota has been the emergence of KJ Osborne, who is most certainly worth an add in redraft leagues right now. When Irv Smith went down, a lot of people still expected Minnesota to run a lot of 2 tight end sets with Chris Herndon, who they traded for, and Tyler Conklin, but that hasn't been the case. Osborne has had 9 and 6 targets in the first 2 weeks. He has more air yards than Adam Thielen and had a hell of a catch and run for a long touchdown on the opening drive this week against the Cardinals. The downside case for him is that he only played 59% of snaps on Sunday, and the Vikings have a pass rate over expected through week 2 of about -3%. So they're still keen on running the ball when they can, and they did almost at will on Sunday. Another surprise for fantasy managers has been Adam Thielen, especially for those that got him in the 4th round, and he's picked up right where he left off last year. He's already scored 3 touchdowns in the first 2 games. He was the only Vikings wide receiver with a 100% snap share on Sunday. And then his counterpart, Justin Jefferson, scored a touchdown on Sunday as well. His monster day is going to come soon because, like I said, he's had back-to-back weeks with 100-plus air yards and was 3rd on the week in air yards share among wide receivers, as you can see on the chart. His weighted targets per route run was a solid 0.8 this week too, along with the 0.86 Whopper, both of those leading the Vikings wide receivers on the week. The Colts wide receivers wasn't actually a group I had planned on wasn't a group I had planned on talking about originally, but Grant in the Discord asked about them, which is another plug to become a member on YouTube, only $5 a month, because you can have some influence on what I talk about. And they actually have a rather interesting scenario right now. Obviously, it's up in the air as to whether Carson Wentz starts, but I'm not sure that Jacob Eason would actually be that big of a downgrade from Wentz. But in any case, Michael Pittman and Zach Pascal appear to be the wide receiver 1 and the wide receiver 2, respectively, in this offense. Pittman had a massive 35% target share and a whopping 58% air yards share in week 2. Both Pascal and Pittman have run routes on 90% of the team's dropbacks in each of the first 2 weeks, but neither has had a particularly strong weighted targets per route run. Pittman was at 0.77 this week, but outside of that, neither of them have had a weighted targets per route run over 0.3 in the other games. And wouldn't you know, Paris Campbell is hurt again, so he didn't play in week 2, which opened up an opportunity for Mike Strawn, and I can confirm that pronunciation despite there being no W in his name, from our resident Colts fan, Eric Belair. Thanks for helping me out with that one. But he only ran a route on 59% of dropbacks in Campbell's absence, only had 1 target, so I wouldn't be rushing to the waiver wire to grab him, as it seems like there's a chance that Campbell plays again in week 3. But if he is available, I would grab Zach Pascal where I can, if you're just looking for some usable wide receiver weeks, even with T.Y. Hilton potentially returning in a couple of weeks. For these last 2 groups of wide receivers, I'm actually going to talk through a different chart that I shared yesterday, which shows the combined target share of the top 3 players on each team, which is essentially intended to show how concentrated each passing attack is. And I actually got inspiration for this from Mike Clay, who tweeted on Sunday that 71% of the Bengals targets have gone to the team's top 3 wide receivers. Chase is at 20%, Higgins at 27%, and Boyd at 24%, which you can see on the chart, and that ranks 4th among all teams. Boyd actually looked like the lone guy left out of the trio in week 1 with only 4 targets, but followed that up with 9 targets in week 2. Higgins led the team in targets with 10 in week 2, and all 3 of these guys had a snap rate over 85%, after Chase was the only one to do that in week 1, and each of them had a routes run rate over 88%, with Boyd actually leading the team with a 94% rate in week 2. The air yard share has actually been a lot different, though, as Boyd hasn't had an air yard share over 20% in either of the first 2 games. Meanwhile, Jamar Chase, just coming out of the gates super fast, has had air yard shares of 52% and 37% in the first 2 games. Higgins posted a really solid 0.4 0.83 weighted targets per out run in week 2, which was 11th among receivers with at least 5 targets. And unfortunately, the bad news for the Bengals is that they're still near the bottom of the league in pass rate over expectation. But with Boyd's solid target day, I'm starting all 3 of these guys when possible. We hope that pass rate increases as the season goes on, as Burrow gets more comfortable, as they're forced into more passing situations. And it's great that each of these guys are having solid years to start, despite the Bengals throwing not as much as we would expect. So on the flip side of this, on the bottom of the chart, you see the Browns are dead last, have their 3 top receivers have a combined target share below 50%, which in my opinion makes none of them startable in any redraft league until we really see some separation in terms of target share from one of these receivers. There was some talk in the Discord this afternoon about Demetric Felton, who had a nice run after the catch to score a touchdown, but he only got 2 targets. He ended up running 61% of his routes out of the slot. Excuse me. So maybe he's the Jarvis Landry fill-in who just got put on IR, so he'll be out for a minimum of 3 games. And maybe Odell Beckham becomes a target hog when he comes back, but even so, they pass so infrequently, even less than the Bengals do. They have the second fewest pass attempts in the league so far this year, that he'll need to be extremely efficient to be fantasy relevant. But I think feel free to hold them on your bench if you have the space. I think it's really only Landry and OBJ that I'm holding, unless you do have a super deep bench, in which case Donovan Peoples-Jones, Anthony Schwartz, and Demetric Felton have some upside, just because there really isn't anyone else there. The tight ends are getting a lot of the shine right now. As you can see, Austin Hooper and David Njoku having the top 2 target shares on the team, but I'd rather have the guy that I'm going to talk about next over any of these players. And going to talk through a couple quick stats here, but I think if you're looking for the wide receiver 1 in Detroit, it's Quintez Cephus, fellow Wisconsin alumni, who has had 6+ targets and a touchdown in each of the first 2 games. He leads the Detroit wide receivers in air yards by a very large margin. He's obviously not the number 1 target in the offense. He might not even be the number 2 option behind Hawkinson and Swift, but he'll have some usable weeks. He's worth an add with how much Detroit will be passing this season, and I think is a solid waiver candidate in what otherwise looks to be a gross week on the waiver wire. Marquez Valdes-Scantling, I said earlier that he's had back-to-back games of 100+ air yards. He is currently the front runner for the Chris Hogan Wind Sprints Receiver of the Year award. He has 268 air yards and only 17 receiving yards. Rodgers missed him on what would have been 2 50+ yard touchdowns on Monday night by overthrowing him when MVS had gotten behind the defense. So if Rodgers throws a better ball, then we're talking about him in a much different light, but he just needs to connect on those deep balls. From Rich Rebar, 3 players have run a pass route on 100% of their team's dropbacks through 2 games, and that includes Cooper Kupp, Terry McLaurin, and JuJu Smith-Schuster. Kupp and McLaurin have both had some really good games so far, and JuJu probably is is going to be heading towards a good game eventually here. We'll see if that does happen eventually. Cortland Sutton led the league in air yards in week 2 with 258 air yards. So he's looking like he could have a great stretch of games without Judy in the mix. And if you want any player from the Houston Texans, it's probably Brandon Cooks. He has logged 303 air yards through the first 2 weeks. He has an outstanding 0.91 Whopper. He still looks explosive. It's just the big question is whether Davis Mills, who I believe will be starting on Thursday night against the Panthers, will be able to support him if Tyrod is out for an extended stretch. And if I'm remembering correctly, he just got put on IR as well, which is unfortunate because he was actually having a really good start to the season, all things considered. All right, let's get into the tight ends, and then I'll talk through some team-specific situations. I have the same chart here for the tight ends as I had for the wide receivers, and I talked about the Saints tight ends last week, but it was a weird situation this week because Troutman didn't record a single target and only ran a route on 32% of dropbacks, which was down significantly from his week one rate of 72%. Meanwhile, Juwan Johnson, who you see at the top right corner of this chart, saw 3 targets again. He led the team in air yards in week 2 with 59. And so far, these two have flip-flopped roles in each week. But this passing attack is so low volume. The Saints have thrown the ball 43 times in 2 games that it'll probably be hard to trust either guy in any non-DFS lineup. I think I'm changing my tune as to whether I prefer Troutman over Johnson, and think Johnson is probably the guy at this point. He's likely to play sort of that Jared Cook role from a couple of years ago where he just scored a ton of touchdowns, but there really isn't anyone on the Saints outside of probably Alvin Kamara that I want to be rostering at this point. Another really weird situation is George Kittle. As Ben Gretsch said in his week 1 newsletter, 1 week is an anomaly, 2 weeks is a concern, and 3 weeks is a trend. Well, we're at week 2. Kittle only has 9 targets on the season, which is still second on the team, but that's with Brandon Ayuk, a presumed breakout, only getting 2 targets so far this season. Kittle also had -6 air yards in week 2, which is kind of crazy. That's sort of the Deebo Samuel role you would expect. And the thesis for drafting Kittle has always been his efficiency. He was never going to get as many targets as Waller or Kelsey or even Hawkinson and Pitts. And we're seeing the downside case for him right now when he's not getting peppered with targets and isn't efficient with them either. The encouraging part is that he saw a route per dropback rate of 88% this week, which is up 30% from his week 1 rate. He was the only other 49ers player besides Deebo Samuel to have a rate over 80%. But at this point, with the way that Hawkinson played Monday night, I think you have to rank him and probably Pitts over him rest of season, but you're still going to start him every week. You didn't draft him to sit him. They play the Packers on, Sunday Night Football in week 3. So hopefully that gives them more reason to throw, since the Packers have been decimated by tight ends to start the season, which also isn't a bit of a surprise. So again, hopefully things turn around in George Kittle. Otherwise, the alarm certainly will be going off. 2 last nuggets here, both actually coming from Jack Miller, who has a great weekly stat roundup article that I would highly suggest reading. The first one being that Gerald Everett and Will Dissly split snaps evenly in week 1. And then in week 2, Everett played 43 snaps and ran 30 routes, while Dissly played 26 snaps, 17 fewer, and ran 21 fewer routes, so only 9 routes in week 2. So it's tough between these guys, and Freddie Swain actually appeared on that chart I showed just before this, showing the concentration of targets as the third option for the Seahawks. So Gerald Everett might just be, again, he's a touchdown dependent tight end at this point, and it isn't anything more than that. The second note here is that Pat Freiermuth, Pat Philhelmuth, has outsnapped Eric Ebron in both games this year, but Freiermuth has run only 35 routes total. He had 23 in week 2, while Eric Ebron has run 37 and 20 in week 2. So it looks like Pat might be a little bit more of the blocking tight end right now. It's to be determined, but I think neither of these guys are startable right now. It's really just the receivers and Najee Harris in the passing game as options. Okay, I'm going to wrap up the show with, I've got 3 team level situations that I'm going to talk through all of the positions for. The first is the Las Vegas Raiders, who have essentially been what we hoped the Bengals and the Falcons would be. They're currently second in the league, behind only the Bucs in pass rate over expected at about 12%, which is pretty crazy. Derek Carr leads the league in both air yards thrown with 429 yards per game, and leads the league in passing yards, with an average of 408 yards per game. And nobody else is averaging more than 345 passing yards per game, which is pretty crazy. Since he hasn't had many touchdowns this season so far and doesn't really have the rushing upside that the other quarterbacks have, he's currently quarterback 8, but if either of those come up throughout the season and the passing yardage stays, then he could probably be a top 6 fantasy quarterback, or at least a top 10. Top 6 might be a little bit of a stretch, but top 10 or top 12 at least, because they're certainly passing the ball a lot, and it almost makes me want to have Josh Jacobs out even longer. Not that I'm wishing for more injuries, but if it makes the Raiders throw the ball more, then I'm all for it. As far as the running backs, I mentioned earlier that James White was second in the league in running back receptions. Well, Kenyon Drake is tied for third with 10 total catches. He has 5 in each of his 2 games played. With Josh Jacobs missing week 2, Drake's snap share climbed to 71%. It wasn't even that bad of a snap share to begin with, because he had 48% in week 1. Jacobs was at 52%, and Peyton Barber was the only other running back that got snaps for the Raiders, if you don't include the Green Bay hero, Alec Ingold. The good thing is that, as I mentioned earlier, Drake's upside remains as a pass catcher, and he ranked inside the top 10 in receiving expected points this week. So if the Raiders keep throwing the ball and Jacobs is out, then Drake is certainly a solid option. As far as the pass catchers, Henry Ruggs have a day. He, on what was one of the best throws on Sunday, Carr connected with Ruggs on a long touchdown to essentially seal the win for the Raiders. Waller, Ruggs, and Renfrow each had 7 targets, and I think they're the top 3 pass catchers for the Raiders at this point. I'm still holding on to Bryan Edwards, as he actually led all Raiders wide receivers in snaps and routes in week 2. But if it weren't for Edwards' late game heroics in the Monday Night Football game against the Ravens in week 1, we'd probably be talking about him as a drop candidate, but all those points count the same. Henry Ruggs had a 0.44 Whopper in week 2, which wasn't great by any stretch of the matter, but it did lead the team. And you can see on the chart, I guess you could see on the chart for the wide receivers that Ruggs and Renfrow were pretty much side by side. So both very different profiles, Ruggs being the deep threat with Renfrow being the slot guy, but they're both having solid seasons to start the year. The next team that I'm going to talk about is the Carolina Panthers, who have also been a bit of a surprise so far this year. And Sam Darnold, the new quarterback for the Panthers, has looked good. It's been a soft schedule for him, but it's still encouraging that Darnold is playing well in these games, and it's better than if he had been playing terribly. And Darnold's averaging about 270 air yards per game, which is middle of the road, but he does have a CPOE, a completion percentage over expectation of 7.4%, which puts him inside the top 10 at quarterback for that stat. I don't think he's a fantasy starter quite yet, but he's playing well enough to support the receivers on this team. And speaking of the receivers, the most notable thing is the complete 180 that DJ Moore and Robbie Anderson have done in terms of roles. Robbie has an average depth of target, or an ADOT, of 22.3 yards, and Moore has an ADOT of 9.5 after Robbie had an ADOT of 9.8 last year, and Moore was at 13.7. So Robbie sort of back to the ways when he was on the Jets, thriving as the deep threat when he and Darnold played together. I think this makes sense, and I hope it remains this way. It means that Anderson's not going to be nearly as consistent as last year, but he's still running a high percentage of routes, being above 85% in each of the first two games, and has some opportunity to grow with an FPO of negative 2.6 this past week. The final thing I'll mention with the Panthers is with regards to Terrace Marshall. He had a really good week one with 6 targets. He had the second highest whopper on the team and a 66% route rate, but he's clearly the fourth option in this passing game behind the two that I've talked about and Christian McCaffrey. You can basically ignore Brandon Zylstra, who scored a touchdown. He didn't play at all in week one and ran only 8 routes this week. I'm holding Marshall for now, but his weekly ceiling is certainly capped. He's only averaging about 5 PPR points per game so far. And while he might get on the field a little bit more, he's, like I said, he's the fourth option on this team. There's not much to say about CMC other than the fact that he could have had a bigger day, which is crazy to say. He got tackled inside the 5 a couple of times and could have had more touchdowns than he ended up having. Which, again, still doesn't make sense why people didn't take him with the 101. All right. Wrapping up this stat chasing episode, going to walk through the Miami Dolphins. Obviously, Tua Tagovailoa had the rib injury on Sunday. The latest is that the x-rays were negative on his ribs, but that he is in a lot of pain. He's considered day-to-day, but I don't think I'd expect him to play this week with how much pain it sounds like he's in. The next guy up is Jacoby Brissett, who didn't play terribly. And again, I don't think is that big of a downgrade from Tua, who hasn't really been lighting the world on fire, but we'll see who gets the start on Sunday. As far as the running backs, Malcolm Brown was phased out pretty heavily in this game as he only had a 12% snap share. 3 of his 4 carries came on the final drive of the game. So that makes it really seem like Myles Gaskin and Salvon Ahmed are the 2 Dolphins backs to hold on to. And between those 2, Gaskin has the clear edge. He has snap shares above 54%, route rates of at least 45%, and 5 targets in each of the first 2 games. He also leads the team with 9 total high-value touches compared to just 2 for Ahmed. Ahmed's seen 6 total targets, which is solid, but he's only played on 27% of snaps so far. But it seems pretty clear that he is the running back 2 on the Dolphins. As far as the receiver, Devontae Parker looks like the downfield threat right now with an ADOT of 11.1 yards, while Jalen Waddle, the rookie, is at 6.1 yards. Will Fuller was obviously inactive this past week, but reports are that he's back with the team now, excuse me, and is expected to play in week 3, which is great news. This just means that what we've seen could be completely flipped on its head, as Fuller is going to be much more impactful than any of Albert Wilson, Preston Williams, or Jakeem Grant. Both Parker and Waddle have had target shares above 19% in each of the first 2 games. So the hope is that with Will Fuller returning, he just eats up all of the target share from the guys I just mentioned, and this becomes a more concentrated passing attack. Final thing I'll mention about this team is that Mike Gesicki, who doubled his target share to 14% this week and increased his snap share to 70%, along with a route percentage of a nice 69%, had a solid outing with 3 catches for 41 yards, which doesn't sound great, but he had 6 targets and 64 air yards, which is really good. He'll need to be more productive to be fantasy relevant going forward, but it certainly is good to see that usage from the tight end. Okay, I think I've said it all for the show today. A couple quick things before I head out. A reminder to, again, subscribe to the YouTube channel, become a member. I plan on going live next week to just members in the Discord. I'll be sharing the link in there when I do go live so that everyone there can take a look as I'm recording this and get some access to it a little bit earlier, and tune into the show tomorrow night talking about waivers. I don't know who the guys are going to talk about this week, but will be a fun show nevertheless. But thanks everyone. Have a great week 3.